Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. We're going to get started here. Welcome to Real Life DevOps Lessons Learned from Morningstar's Path to Monolithic to Microservices. My name is Chris Munns from AWS. I'll introduce myself a little further here in a moment. Just some housekeeping here for those of you who have just joined. When you joined, you selected how you wanted to get audio for today's webinar. And so that can either be by you dialing into a phone number or via your computer in front of you and the speaker or the headphones. If for any reason you want to change that, you can change that selection by accessing the audio panel in the sidebar. So you should see a sidebar kind of somewhere on one of the two sides of this video here. And from there, you can go and change it up if for any reason the connection is not as good or you want to switch to one of the other ones. Also from this control panel, you'll have the ability to enter questions today. So we are going to be doing some live Q&A from this talk. I'm going to be moderating those questions and trying to filter them on to Adam and Stephen here who are joining us. And so throughout the whole presentation, feel free to toss those questions in there. We'll break occasionally to take a view at those and see what's going on with them. But we are definitely going to try to answer as many of those as we can. If we can't answer your question during the live session today, we're going to take those questions back and try to get back to you via email. So if you do have a question, maybe that is, maybe one that we don't want to answer in front of a large audience, maybe it's something deeper about what you're trying to do, we might table that one for an email, but we're going to do our best to get through all of those. And so with that, we're going to get started here. So again, my name is Chris Munns. I'm currently Senior Manager and Principal of Developer Advocacy for Serverless at AWS. And again, I am today the moderator. I'm joined here by Adam and Stephen, who I'll let say a quick bit about themselves. So Adam, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Adam Johnson. I'm the Principal Product Manager at New Relic. I'm responsible for serverless and cloud services products at New Relic.
And I'm Stephen Weinberg. I'm the Director of QA and DevOps at Morningstar. As much as I hate the idea of DevOps in a title of a job title, it has unfortunately worked its way into our system.
Awesome, thanks guys. So we've got a whole lot of stuff that we want to cover here today. This is basically how we're going to try to spend the next hour here. Again, we're going to go into as much depth as we can for these various topic areas. We're going to start off in a moment here with hearing more from Stephen about what Morningstar has done and their journey through DevOps, the experience that they've had. We're then going to swap to a little bit more of a panel conversation where we've got 5 key topic areas that we're going to be diving a bit deeper into. There's going to be some back and forth between all of us about our experiences. Then going to hand it off to Adam, who's going to walk you through a pretty exciting demo. I will say that Adam was not brave enough to tempt the demo gods today, so this is a pre-recorded demo, which I think is probably the better way to go. And then we'll start to wrap this up with some key takeaways, and then we will bring it back to the audience Q&A. And again, we're going to try to save about 10 to 15 minutes for that here at the end. And then we'll have some next steps, things to follow up on. But again, we really appreciate you joining us here today. With that, Stephen, I want to hand it off to you to talk a little bit more about who Morningstar is, what your journey has been like, and any examples you'd like to share.
Sure. So Morningstar, as I jokingly say, we're your typical 36-year-old startup. It's we were started back in 1984, it was an idea founded in a guy's apartment. That was the idea that there needs to be transparency in financial information so that individual investors have a reasonable standing to compete and get outcomes similar to institutional investors. So very mission driven. It's kind of exciting where it's gone. The problem with that is we succeeded. And so over 36 years, you think about all the changes that have happened in technology since 1984, we're still dealing with those. Products that worked really well, people loved, we've still got to deal with. Obviously, we've updated them to some degree over the time, but there are a lot of challenges. Right now, our products are both data in and of itself, as well as software products for people to use. And we have everything from RESTful APIs to software as a service and platforms to desktop applications, and even cases where we're still mailing out CDs for people to get their data updates. So each of these comes with its own set of challenges, and obviously some things we enjoy trying to support, and other things are a little bit more of a pain. that wide range of technology, the different technology stacks, their teams using .NET, their teams using Java, their teams using Node.js, pretty much any JavaScript library that's been around in the past 10 years that people have gotten excited about, we've tried out, and again, sometimes we've succeeded. And that means we continue to support it. So they're the different technology eras that are represented, the different business eras when we did business in one form or another. And so there are certain groups that aren't allowed to talk to other groups. And so how do you get around, or not get around those regulations, but how do you manage those to make, as an operations and dealing with development and releases, that go as smoothly and automated as possible. Additionally, our processes, there are times where we were more centralized, there were times where we were more diffuse, and so figuring out how do we bring that diffusion back together, and in cases where the centralization really put a burden on some teams to be sub-ideal, how do they adjust and get back to being in a better state? And then our clients. Some clients came in early on and expect one type of service model, other ones have a different expectations. All of that comes into play in how we do business, how we release software, how we support software, and how we troubleshoot it. Tied into this, some of the sort of less obvious issues that come up are they're really deep dependencies. So, and we talk about this as being the journey from monolith to microservices. And so even with monoliths, there were still a lot of dependencies. So we have data collections. How do we process and bring data into our system, into our data stores? How do we do transformations? How do we let teams know that there's new data? And so even though in a lot of cases teams were keeping their own separate copies of databases to work with their own applications, they still needed a way of getting updates. And so there are a lot of those deep dependencies on how data moves through our systems. There was very inconsistent monitoring. So a lot of times if something went down, a downstream dependency would be the team that would say, hey, something's broken, or even a client would call and say, hey, I'm having problems getting XYZ. And so really figuring out how do we untangle those dependencies to know what influences what and what's going on was a big challenge. And then inconsistent logging. So even when we knew that there was something going on, how do we start logging that in a way that means we can speak the same language so that one team can give a reference to another team that is meaningful, that they can look up, that it's not just, well, here's the primary key in our database, which if you're using separate databases and your primary keys are either GUIDs or identities, is really not going to help any other team other than your own. So figuring out how we bridge those gaps in understanding, in languaging, and identifiers themselves has all been sort of the different challenges we've faced. And coming into that has been the defining what a DevOps culture is. How do we start working with that? Where do we pilot? How do we expand? And what tools do we need to support us? Which brings us to all of this.
So it sounds pretty straightforward and simple. So it sounds like we should just be able to get through this pretty quickly today, huh?
That's to a degree one of the big challenges is from an executive level standpoint, it can be pretty simple and it can boil down to talk to each other. Why aren't your ID, like, why don't you track other people's IDs? There are a lot of very simple sounding solutions that, especially when you're dealing with a post-mortem after an incident, can very quickly turn to fairly blameful rather than blameless or blame aware. But the concepts for solutions are fairly straightforward. Implementing them takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, which is one of the cases where we sort of run into executive burnout, where they think that we're further along in the process than we actually are. And there's a level of frustration of, wait, we're still talking about this? Because when you get into the details, when you get into the weeds, where you really need to spend a lot of your time, it gets hairy.
Yeah. Well, you've definitely given us a lot to try to unpack here, and I think it's in a couple different angles, right? You talked about technology challenges, you talked about technology team challenges, both between similarity in processes or commonality in processes, I should probably say, driving communication standards. How do you understand who has what information? How are they sharing that information through client side? You mentioned you've got the full range of REST APIs through shipping CDs. There's only maybe a couple of handfuls of companies in the world that have similar challenges. and I assure you that probably almost all of them are trying to get away from that mailing out the CD model.
Yeah.
Up through, like you mentioned here at the very end, right, executive situations. How do you communicate the fact that some of these aren't just things you put on a roadmap, right? You've got cultural challenges that lend themselves to technology challenges, and you kind of have this yin and yang of which one gets solved, and or maybe chicken and egg is the better way to put it, of, you know, what comes first, the cultural side or the technology side. So lots to unpack here. So for the next couple minutes, we actually are going to now dive a little deeper and unpack these. And we've got basically 5 key areas that we're going to unpack and talk about. The first is observability. We'll then be talking about common languages and what that means. Then we'll talk about bridging teams. And we'll get Stephen to talk a little bit about what's next at Morningstar, what stuff they're chasing here for the future in the next couple of months, and then come back to kind of the benefit of hindsight. You know, what would you do differently next time, as it were? So let's kick off with observability. You know, obviously observability means a lot of things to a lot of people. I talk a lot to AWS customers about observability. Adam, obviously, from Relic, talks about observability every day and every night. And then Stephen, in your role, thinking and talking about observability is a really big deal. How do you see observability, and this is for both of you here, playing a role in this journey from, you know, the monolith to the microservices, distributed systems? You know, at AWS, we'd call it like a 2-pizza team model. You know, where do you see that fitting in? And we'll start with Stephen and then go to Adam.
Just quick ground level. I subscribe to sort of Charity Majors, her definition of observability, that is the ability to ask open-ended questions of your software without having to redeploy. So just at a high level, that's what I'm meaning by it. There are a lot of nuances going from there. But with a monolith, we could kind of get away with not having great practices because it was all us. The pockets of sort of specialized knowledge, the being able to grab a DBA and have them run queries against the database that you know is what's giving you the data. There were ways around having the tools, the logging that gave us what we needed. Still wasn't great. It was painful and it was frustrating, but we could manage it. The more and more dependencies, the more teams, the more this idea of microservices comes in, the more necessary to really start defining observability a lot more. Big things that we've done have been to have a shared request ID, the concept of a request ID that is defined and established. So whichever team is the first one to start working with something, if you get a request in that does not have a request ID in your headers, then you create one and you add it in and you pass it on. And all teams need to be able to create a request ID, need to be able to accept a request ID, and need to be able to pass it on. And that is something that's required in our logging standards. And that way we start building out threads that can go all the way from the front end to the back end. And that's just sort of, that's the table stakes in order to get towards observability for us.
Adam, I'll pass it on to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Stephen on the definition of observability. I think there's it's its own topic, just defining it. But I think in general, it's not monitoring. It's really the idea about having all of your data in one place and the tools to be able to use that data and answer those questions. And I think another important part of that is in order to make the developers and anyone really using the observability platform be effective is the ability to correlate relevant data together. So that's where where Stephen mentioned using those request IDs is really key to be able to tie those things together using things like distributed tracing, and getting as much out of that as you can, I think is really important. And one thing that we've focused on at New Relic is really making sure that the telemetry instrumentation is as automatic as possible. We don't want to have developers spending all day instrumenting their code. I think it's very important to have a culture around instrumenting your code. The more instrumentation you put into your code, the more you're going to get out of it, and the more time it's going to save you at the end of the day. It's going to help you answer those really tough questions. But at the same time, I think it's the tool and the platform's job to provide a lot of that out of the box where possible, so that you can focus on instrumenting business logic and not necessarily like a database call from one service to another service. That should be out of the box.
Yeah. Go ahead. I was going to say real quick that the cultural challenge is a big one, getting people to really care about it. A lot of times folks will think, this isn't my problem, this should be done after the fact, or, to a degree, this is why organizations are giving people the title SRE, and then it becomes kind of a bolt-on after the fact type of thing in some organizations. Curious, Stephen, what have you seen work in, encouraging the technical folks at Morningstar to really care about this?
And a lot of it has been recognizing how often work gets interrupted. And so that concept of unplanned work and figuring out how do we make sure that developers get to spend their time developing rather than one of the big things that happens for us is an executive or someone will be working with it have a bad outcome that is pretty anecdotal rather than statistical. So none of our monitors will go off. We won't see any real blip in terms of error rates, in terms of response times at the 90th, 95th percentile, but someone important to us, often internal, has a bad outcome. And so we'll get an email saying, hey, why did login take 3 minutes? And we're like, what are you talking about? And all of a sudden, because it's them, people will drop what they're doing. There'll be the rush to try and figure it out. And it gets really frustrating. Because often then we can't figure it out. To try and spot that one thing that happened one time is really, really difficult. And so that's something that we're working on, how to get better at that executive factor. But the more we could quantify the pain caused by not having this, the more excited people were to get engaged with it. Additionally, we had to build the trust that we could do something about it. So, and it's great to show, it's horrible when you show people pretty things they can't have. It's awesome when you can show them a pretty thing and say, oh, by the way, I already built it.
Yeah. So I want to piggyback a little bit off of there. I feel like the next topic we have kind of lends itself to a little bit what you talked about just now, which is this concept of common languages. Now, common languages could mean that you're a single tool shop. Everyone's Java. Don't ask for anything else. You're not going to get it. It can also mean a language around how product development is done, how operations is done. So like commonality in the tools in the toolbox, not just saying you have one hammer, one screwdriver. How do you think about what that means for you at Morningstar, and how you try to keep that commonality as universal as you can inside the organization?
Yeah, and for us, we had to back way up in terms of where we started. Like, what does it mean to be a developer? What does it mean to be QA? What does DevOps mean? We've been struggling with those definitions for a while. I think at this point, we're getting fairly close to some solid answers, but then using those as first principles and arguing from first principles allows us to start building out more and more depth to what these mean. So the one big thing that's been happening recently is really getting QA has set enough test automation and integrated into release pipelines so that developers, when they're checking in code, can easily run the QA automation against their code. And from a CI/CD standpoint, this is again table stakes, but it all of a sudden puts the role of QA is not to test software. The role of QA is to make sure that we have adequate tests to establish risk and to make risks transparent. And so developers are then the ones who actually run tests. Developers are the ones who update tests, just like they would update their unit tests if they break something, or if the unit test starts breaking the build deploy, they would update the test automation. Similarly, it's easy to then hand off that package to dependencies so that dependencies can release independently with confidence. We don't need to be part of their release to verify because they can just run our test automation. So we start speaking common language around what roles are, which allows us to speak common languages around what done means. And going through a definition of done exercise is hugely rewarding, as long as people, and again, that idea of blameless postmortem, the idea of having blameless definition of done conversations where you're actually curious, like, well, wait, what does done mean? How does that play out? And then having definitions of a release, definitions of code check-in, all of these start to fall out of that in really exciting ways.
You said definition of done, and my leg flinched. I don't know if it's an
Same
old
here.
wound or something that made that
Well,
happen.
it's been played out so many times, and there's so many memes that mock it.
Hmm.
And at the same time, it's really like we started defining, like in our definition of done, there is unit test coverage percentages that should be happening for new lines of code. There's test automation percentages for critical test cases, for high level of test cases. And so really getting very specific about what does it mean for software to be considered done, which is then also exciting because it starts to facilitate blameless postmortems. Because rather than that, like, well, you were an idiot because you released this with no unit tests, or with only 90% unit tests, it's like, oh, well, we all agreed that 80% was acceptable. So why did our understanding of what done should be not yield the outcome we wanted? And so it starts in a good common language inspires curiosity across teams because we can actually talk to each other and we recognize and trust each other because we're speaking the same language.
Yeah, Adam, many years ago, I discovered New Relic in a previous life, and I remember that excitement or that feeling about being like, this is the one tool that I can use to bring a lot of this stuff together. And in my mind, that was always like one of the strongest benefits. And when I used to represent the DevOps space at AWS, I used to talk about, again, as Stephen was talking about here, the common language is being more about a tool and a motion. How would you maybe describe about how some of the stuff that New Relic has built into the product that enables some of that as well, whether you're talking about like this handoff between, dev and ops and QA and other parts of the business that can find that common language as part of, observability tooling and so forth.
Yeah, so New Relic, I think, has done a really stellar job of providing as many capabilities as you can imagine in a single platform, and I think that is very powerful because you want to be able to have a common language around tooling as well. Whether you're using a single platform like New Relic or having a small set of tools, I think it's really important that cross teams you have agreement on these are the tools we're using for these purposes, so that when things go wrong, you know where to look. Or when you're onboarding new engineers or employees, they are not lost in trying to get access to certain tools that they've never heard of because this team off to the corner is using this tool and so on. So I think that that's important to have as many capabilities as possible in as few tools as possible to avoid that sprawl. And what's the added benefit of having that into a consolidated set of tools is that you're basically you have this data gravity where your data is being stored in a few amount of places. If you do that, you're able to then take advantage of correlation, which really saves you a lot of time, because as you're going through and asking these questions and finding answers to these questions about your application, about how things are running, you don't want to have to jump between a bunch of different tools, looking at different timelines, trying to hunt down a particular answer can take a bunch of time in just trying to log into a tool. You want to be able to have all of that available and have the context all in one place so you can take advantage of that. So I think that's really important to get across teams, across the organization, is get that as clean as possible. It's a very difficult conversation to have because people get very passionate about their tools, but I think it's also very important. And I think the other aspect of that is there's a lot of improvements being made in open standards. New Relic has been investing heavily in open telemetry as well as open sourcing a lot of our software. We recently just open sourced all of our agents that were previously proprietary. They're now open source and available. People can contribute to them, and we're big contributors to open telemetry so that you can use one set of telemetry agents or libraries and be able to use those across a set of tools. Or if you're used to using a particular tool like Prometheus, you can send that data into New Relic as well. So I think that's the direction where things are headed, and I think that takes a lot of the pain away from having that common language in terms of observability.
Awesome. So Real quick, so again, for folks who have joined us here, I know a couple joined right after our intro. This is live. We are all virtually in our various locations here. There is a QA box that is off to the side here in the menu bar, and we're getting a bunch of questions coming in. We do have a designated QA time at the end of this, but I just got a message from someone who joined us whose name is Jeff. Jeff can only stay to the bottom of the hour. Jeff has asked a whole bunch of questions. And so what I want to actually do here, Jeff, if you're still here and you didn't have that next call join, I want to try to get to some of them real quick, in line though with our next topic. Whoops, went too far. So the next topic, Stephen, that we were going to cover here is around bridging teams, and you talked about this, different parts of the business, different teams, different priorities, legacy, reasons for keeping the business broken up for various reasons, and one of the questions that we have here from Jeff was, was there really like a top-down initiative to make this move? So did you have like senior executives saying this is important for the business for us to think about it? Second was there actually like a formal, this is the business plan to make this journey? So A, I'll let you talk a little bit about the bridging of the teams, but B, want to come back to what was the involvement of the executives, and was this actually, say, like a documented C-level initiative, or VP or SVP level, or was it more of just a natural thing, which we've seen a lot of companies where it starts small little fire over here and then it kind of spreads faster?
It's a bit of all of that. So there was executive level buy-in in terms of promoting, we want the DevOps, which is less helpful than it is frustrating at times, because it doesn't come with a clear definition, it doesn't come with a roadmap, and it often doesn't come with any actual money or recognition. So we were in that state for a couple of years. Along with that, there was executive push and mandating of everyone to get on Splunk, which was really useful. There were definitely challenges, like we didn't come out with logging standards at the same time. And so everybody getting on Splunk was not necessarily the same as us to really be able to use Splunk very well. And then probably one of the more clear examples of executive buy-in and getting engaged was there was a real decision to let's implement the SRE model. And so we created a few different SRE teams in different areas. We definitely did the anti-pattern in some cases, where we took operations teams and waved the magic wand and said, you are now SRE, do it, without any support, any training. I was kind of lucky in that I got to start a new SRE team where there hadn't been an operations team, so that was one of sort of the opportunities to build it out with no expectations of, well, why isn't it working yet? So I had a little bit more time and shelter to actually get stuff set up and to go through the complexity of that. So there was a lot of different phases to it, because a lot of times executives aren't necessarily around as long as some of the longtime team members, and so the attention span can be shorter. And there was some really helpful stuff as well. So it's a mixture of all of those, and there were definitely challenges that came out of that. But the idea of, as we started to develop better logging standards, as we set up linting around those logging standards, those really helped. As we had teams set up and some of the organizational structure to give a very clear peer group for people to get together, that's also really helped. And some of that has also been, like, the peer groups have gotten together, have fallen apart, have reformed. So there's a mixture of the amoeba process and grassroots mixed into that as well.
Yeah, and I just like to add on the New Relic side, we've gone through similar journeys ourselves, and we definitely try to partner with our customers by really sharing our lessons learned along the way as well. So we spend a lot of our time not only just like training users how to use the product, but really just talking about how do we deliver software and how do we operate that in production, since we have to, New Relic is ingesting tons of data every single minute from tons of customers, and it's all critical, right? We need to be sure that we're up all the time because people rely on us, and we've learned a lot of lessons along the way, and we spend a lot of our time really partnering up with our customers to talk through a lot of these specific journeys and pain points along the way. And we learn from our customers as well. It's a constant journey that seemingly never ends.
Yeah, and that just sort of that sharing of pain points. One of my early experiences with New Relic was reading the postmortem on the Kafka apocalypse that you had like 5-6 years ago now. But that use of major incidents to dig in, do blameless postmortems, share the lessons learned, generate curiosity, generate trust is a really great way to bridge teams.
I'm gonna put Adam on the spot very briefly here. Adam, would you say that the best customers that you have, and we'll say best in a sense of really kind of living and breathing observability, would you say that their path started at the top or started, in the trenches? And I'm sure there's no generalization, but I'm going to ask you to just make one up for the sake of argument.
It's a really great question. I think that it's hard to find a place where it's an either or. There's always a combination of both. I think that if you have just a top down, it's not going to be effective until you have buy-in at the bottom up. So I think that's a really key thing, and everybody finds that path eventually, but it's just a question of the timing for that. I think in general, if you have a in the trenches, bottoms up approach, it's going to be a lot faster of a journey because a lot of that culture has already started. There's a desire for improving by the individual contributors versus a top down, if it comes out of nowhere saying we need to DevOps all the things. That's a different starting point where you have to start really talking about the culture and really get buy-in at all levels of the organization for that to happen. So I think it totally depends, but in general, if you're seeing signals from your organization, from across the organization, where you're having people at all layers looking to make these improvements themselves without that direction, that's a good environment for making change.
Awesome. So I'll move on to our next topic here. And this is kind of back to Stephen here. So what's next for Morningstar? And I have to say, you're all fairly far down this journey when you start talking about things like definition of done. You've talked about some, cabals forming, splitting up, reforming, reshifting, various different levels of experimentation, first principles. Again, these are things that I think that people who are maybe a little more battle scarred in these journeys coming back to them. However, this is not a journey that really has an end. It's not like you arrive at the beach and there you are. What kind of things do you see, and what other advice would you have for people who are starting off?
Oh, and if you're starting off, the biggest thing is to figure out where you are and how do you get a lay of the land, meet teams. We were just having our DevOps peer group meeting before this, and we were talking about how do we have better consistency in terms of our branching strategy and our release process. And the question was like, is there a best practice for doing branching strategies that we can use because our teams are doing all sorts of different things? And the answer was a real quick yes, do trunk-based development, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of discussion of how difficult that was and how all the different, like where the places that we needed to meet teams, figure out how do they get a process to get there. Dealing with different legacy code sets, different challenges in terms of QA and verification, all kinds of things come up. So if you're starting out, figure out where you are, figure out, and to me, one of the big things that was useful was Google's hierarchy of needs for SRE, and figure out where you are on that pyramid. And they stole from Maslow with the psychology hierarchy of needs, but it was a really great way for me to sort of like, okay, where are we on this? How does this fit? And there are a lot of other different evaluations of maturity models and using that. They're all flawed, they're all good. Pick one that resonates. In terms of the stuff that we're really digging into, a lot of it is figuring out how do we get so that we don't need human intervention for our UAT releases. and therefore building the trust that we can have no human intervention for a prod release. And so getting to that sort of the CD part of the CI/CD. Getting continuous integration, we've gotten pretty good at. Continuous delivery, we still have a chunk to go. And the trusting that what we have is going to work, that we have enough testing, that the testing we have is automated, and that automation can run fast enough that we can start pushing things out quicker is a big piece. Mixed in with that from sort of the prod focus rather than the pre-prod is having better definitions, to use Google's term, of SLIs and SLOs, the service level indicators and service level objectives. As we start to have more and more APIs and more dependencies, really having very deep conversations about what are the indicators that something is working on, getting again back to definition of done. What is the definition of health? And what is that in terms of latency? What is that in terms of numbers of requests? What is that in terms of error rates? What is that in terms of data freshness, of data completeness? And really starting to be able to have those clearly defined so that, again, we can set up automated alerts and monitoring around those. Spoiler for the lessons that we wish we had learned sooner, one of the big ones is to make sure that anything we care enough to document and define, that we have an automated way to track.
Awesome. And now we're just gonna, for the sake of time here, come to our last point, which is kind of similar to this about what's next. What would you say in terms of hindsight, top 2-3 things you would absolutely do differently, if it was Groundhog's Day and you had to come back and do all this again, which I realize it's a journey, it's a long period of time, but if there were specific things that you would unwind or do differently.
Yeah, and the one that I just sort of alluded to, that idea of make sure that you can track the things you care about, or for us, make sure that we can track the things we cared about. With logging standards, we had the logging standards for probably 4 years before we had a linter to be able to actually check, are people following the logging standards? And we still don't have an automated way to run that linter against all of our Splunk indexes. So that's something that'd be really useful. Like, how do we actually help people to be able to know if they're following the logging standards or not? And to a degree, if you want to go the other direction, how do we enforce that they are doing it if they are not and aren't interested in doing it? Additionally, a big thing is just figuring out a better way for teams to either have versioning systems so that they can release independently, or a better way for teams to get sign-off from their dependencies in order to be able to release independently. Our releases, even though we started breaking things up fairly quickly and we're able to release code or deploy code separately, the releases had to be coordinated. And so that concept of splitting release from deployment, and deployment being a technical issue and release being a business decision, we've gotten really stuck where they're very, very tight together, and the dependencies across teams are also really tight. And so I think getting a better approach to decoupling that early on would have been really helpful.
Awesome. So again, I've gotten a bunch of folks asking questions here. We are going to handle a Q&A right after Adam goes through the demo he's about to give us here. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to Adam. But again, for those of you who are asking questions, a couple who've come back and said, what about my question? I want more details. We're going to give Stephen a thorough grilling. We've actually got him a spotlight in his room that he'll put on his face. And then we'll get to that. But I want to hand it over here to Adam to talk a little bit more about some of the stuff that New Relic is working on.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Steve. Chris. Cool. So I'll go really quick, and again, I have recorded a really quick, really tight 10-minute demo. I'm going to show off 2 brand new things that New Relic has. And for those who don't know New Relic, we're an observability platform. We have a ton of different offerings underneath this platform. It started with APM, where you can get insights about the performance of your applications. We've since added a lot of capabilities such as distributed tracing, synthetics, so you can monitor the uptime of your applications end to end with canaries. We have things like deployment tracking built in, and we've recently added stuff such as logs, full logs. So if you wanted to have all of your logs along with your metrics in one place, you can do that. Today, I'm going to focus on two things, though. One is serverless. We have had New Relic serverless for about a year now, but we've been making some really incredible improvements to the product, and I'm going to specifically show off some of those today really quickly to give you an idea about what it is you can get in terms of observability and telemetry out of the box without any code changes for your Lambda functions. And this kind of goes back to taking a lot of the burden away from your developers so that they can instead focus on instrumenting the business logic. You shouldn't have to worry about instrumenting all of your network calls or all of your database calls to figure out what's going on. Instead, if you put that time towards business logic, you're able to understand the impact of your customer or the impact of your business as events flow through the system. So I'll show off this really quick, and then the next thing I'll show in the demo is a brand new integration we just announced. This is the first place we're doing a demo, so you're all very lucky here. We've integrated with AWS X-Ray for our distributed tracing. So AWS X-Ray has really fantastic visibility through the AWS managed services, and we've integrated with X-Ray so that we're able to pull that trace information out and store it into a single platform. So again, this kind of ties back to what Stephen was saying about having that common language, having those common tools so that you don't have to jump between a bunch of different views to search through things. And this distributed tracing integration really gives you that easy way to trace business logic and events through all the way from the end to end, from browser all the way to the other side of it. So I'll jump into that demo now, and then we'll get back to the questions right after that.
All right, so let's get started by logging into New Relic 1. And right away, you'll see I'm going to jump straight into the Entity Explorer. And the Entity Explorer is a place where you can see details about every single service that we're monitoring. An entity in New Relic is essentially a service that can range from traditional server hosts that you're monitoring, mobile applications, browser applications, synthetic monitors to monitor your uptime, as well as AWS services and other things. You'll see here that there's a huge list of AWS services. I'm going to today focus on Lambda functions, just to show you what that looks like here, and show you what our no-code instrumentation looks like out of the box. I've filtered down by Lambda functions. You can see there's 622, quite a few. Today I'm going to be focusing on a burrito delivery app that's fully serverless that I'm working on here. So I'm going to just filter down to functions with the name burrito in them, and that filtered down from 600 to 12. Much easier for me to manage. So here I can very quickly see some basic details about these functions. I can see there's this instrumented column, and this tells me which of the functions I've added the Lambda layers to. So I have a few that are instrumented. I have a few that are not yet. If you don't have those functions instrumented, you will still see some basic information. As you can see here, you'll see the error rates and invocations and durations, but you won't get really detailed level of information. You won't get logs, distributed tracing, and things like that. So I'll jump into a function here to show you what a instrumented function looks like. So here I pulled up one of these functions that's making up this burrito delivery app. It's the process order function. And right off the bat, you can see a number of things that can kind of help you understand what this function is actually doing. On the right-hand side here, you see the event source. So you can kind of guess this was being triggered by DynamoDB. Here's the ARN for that DynamoDB stream that's triggered this function and how many times it's triggered it. It looks like this is the only trigger. If there were multiple triggers, you'd be able to see those listed here, and you could even filter out. So if you just wanted to see if a particular API gateway or ALB stage that you're looking at, you wanted to filter down to that, you can just click on that button and it will filter down specifically to that view. So that's really handy. right off the bat, you probably saw this kind of colorful chart here. This is the duration chart. It shows you in great detail where the time is being spent in this Lambda function. So I can very quickly see, all right, here's all the calls being made that range from database calls like this MySQL insert right here to web calls like a call to Stripe right here. I can also see calls to other AWS services like I can see there's another Lambda function that's being invoked from here to US East 1. And I can see the duration over time here. All of these by default are showing P50, but if I wanted to see at a different percentile, just to see what does this look like from a spike perspective, let me just pop in 99.99, and I can see very quickly where those spikes are happening. I can see a big chunk of the time is being spent calling out to Stripe. So that may be something that I want to look into later. You'll also see down here cold starts. So you can see there's a number of cold starts, not very many cold starts, considering how many invocations I have. So I'm not really concerned about cold starts. They typically aren't a problem for me. But it's nice to know, it's nice to have that data just to see, is this something I should worry about or not? You'll also see the invocations over time, as well as the max memory along with the memory available. This is really helpful to figure out, have you sized your Lambda appropriately? Choosing the right CPU memory tier can be difficult, but if you have this visualization here, this can really help you out. You can see that during this time, we were about to run out of memory here. We were provisioned at 128 megabytes, but we were using up almost all of that. So at some point, I upped the memory tier to 192, and that's a little more comfortable for me. You'll also see the error rate here. Up here, you probably noticed that. There's a big spike in errors in the past here where it went up to 100%. So we can jump into the errors and let's do a little debugging to see what that looks like. So I'll click on errors on the left. And here you can see some groupings of errors that we have. You can see the error rate over time again here, along with the actual errors that have happened. And we've rolled these up here. So you're not just seeing, hundreds of invocations all on one screen. You can very quickly see, all right, here's the errors that are happening. They're grouped, how many times those errors are happening. And I can see when they've happened on this chart as well. So let's maybe look at the last error that happened here, the syntax error. Let me just click on that. There were 15 invocations, as I can see. If I click on that, that's going to pull up all of those 15 invocations that triggered that error. And I can see the full stack trace here. You can easily single click copy that to your clipboard, paste that in a ticket or your Slack channel to share with your team. And you'll see a bunch of really rich information about these invocations. I can see the detailed durations. Where's all the time being spent here? I can see that MySQL insert. I can see the call to Lambda and the call to these external services here as well. You also see at the top, this was a cold start. We detected this was a cold start and it was an error. And you'll see, of course, the duration versus what you have the timeout configured at as well. So we've set the timeout at 5 seconds for this function. We have plenty of time left here, so that I'm not really worried about that. If we do have a timeout, that will show up as a timeout error, and I can see what those look like as well. At the bottom here, you can see there are some custom attributes. I did do a little bit of manual instrumentation, a few lines of code to basically add some business logic into this instrumentation. Totally optional, but really helpful to see things like customer ID or the number of burritos ordered or the order ID, which can help me figure out information about the business that's actually flowing through these events. So it's not just raw metrics that I'm looking at here. This actually means something. I know this customer had this particular error, and that's really helpful for me to do debugging. I can also jump into the logs if that's not enough information. And here you'll see full logs for this invocation. If you wanted to jump to the last invocation, if you're doing active debugging, let's say you just pushed out a fix and you ran an invocation, and you can just click this button and jump to the most recent invocation that threw this error, and you can see the logs there. Or again, you can see all of those metrics. It's really easy to jump from function down to the specific invocations of interest. You don't have to sift through, tens of thousands or millions of invocations to get this data. So it's really useful to have that. Now I'm going to show off some X-ray integration. So we've recently just announced an integration with AWS X-ray. This is really cool because while we have distributed tracing with New Relic out of the box, that can't provide detailed information about many AWS managed services because there's nowhere to install a layer or an agent to measure those things. So X-ray is a really great service that provides that level of detail, especially for AWS managed services out of the box. Oftentimes, all you need to do is check a box in your AWS console to enable X-ray for those services. So I've already enabled X-ray on a number of services. And this is the New Relic AWS integration configuration page. Here you'll see a list of all of the services that we integrate with. There's quite a few. And now you'll see X-ray as one of those. So all you have to do is check that box, click save, and you'll start seeing traces flowing in automatically to New Relic. So we'll pull the traces from X-ray, we'll convert them over to our format and store them in our database. And you can have all of your New Relic traces as well as your X-ray traces all in one place. It's really handy. I've pulled up an interesting trace that I've discovered from X-ray here that's coming through API gateway and triggering a Lambda function. So I just wanted to show you what that looks like in New Relic. So I can see right off the bat, we can see 3 anomalous spans. We do anomaly detection on your distributed trace data. It tells you interesting things like this was 1,410% slower than other spans. And if I want to jump to that span, you can see on the right here, you see the duration over time. You can see where that was. You can see that spike there. There was a throughput, little bit of a throughput surge happening there. And you can see the histogram. If you wanted to get into deep details about this span, you can see the attributes that we pulled in as well, such as the account IDs, the stage for that API gateway, the category was HTTP. You can see that this was an error. It was a post, and I can see it was a 502 error. And you can see the URL for that as well. So really helpful debugging information here. But if you wanted to jump to the metrics for that API gateway, all I have to do is click this button, and there's card kind of swipes in. And here you see the errors. I can see there's 500 errors that are happening over time here. I can see the throughputs and the request and the latency for this API gateway as well. Now this API gateway is also triggering a Lambda function. So if I wanted to see details about that, I can also click on that link there, and that will pull up details about that Lambda function. And again, I'll see really nice level of detail here where I can see, all right, this function is doing a DynamoDB put, and I can see what that looks like over time. I can see the P90 for that as well to see if there's any spikes. Everything looks okay. It's really easy for us to jump from trace data to that entity data in New Relic. It's really handy. And again, you get this really nice level of rich data out of the box without doing any sort of manual instrumentation. It's all using Lambda layers, and it's really super easy. And for the X-ray integration, all you have to do is click that box, and you'll start seeing that rolling into your New Relic interface. It's really handy. Hope you try it out. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Adam, any closing words after that demo there? That was, at least to me personally, pretty exciting, but I come from the serverless business at Amazon, so that was cool stuff.
Yeah, I hope I tried to show off as much as I could in a short amount of time. There's so much more that's in there. I'm happy to please reach out to us at New Relic, or if you want to give it a shot, we have a free trial. You can just sign up and give it a shot for free and see what it looks like with your own functions and your own AWS services.
Cool, awesome. All right, so I'm going to jump over here to the Q&A. I know we've got just a couple minutes left, and we've got some burning questions from folks. So far you've heard Stephen talk a bit about the journey that Morningstar made in regards to cultural aspects, in regards to how they think about tools and things like common languages, observability. One burning question that we got here from someone, Stephen, that maybe you can answer is, what was kind of the technology stack before and after? I'm sure there's a lot of technologies at Morningstar, but if there was maybe, say, some commonality, what does that look like today?
So to a degree, I don't think this has significantly changed our tech stack. Most of our, like the main languages we're working with are Java, .NET, and Node.js. In terms of heavy-duty programming, we've somewhat standardized towards Vue.js for JavaScript libraries. And so there had been a effort to standardize JavaScript libraries that came out of another company that we worked with that lasted for 2 or 3 years, and then the efforts, it was sort of inner sourced, and then the team that was working on it and advocating for it got disbanded, and so no one was taking care of it, and then bloat just started coming in fast, and so it became really difficult to work with. So I think there was a standardization towards Vue.js away from the other stacks, but that had more just sort of to how we managed open source software and work teams putting that together internally. And so there have been a lot of changes there. There's been a lot more efforts to be stack independent. So really coming, like we have our design team is having Morningstar design standards and the Morningstar design system where they're really laying out definitions for what do web buttons look like, what kind of mouse over actions, how do those behave, and coupling that with code samples. And doing their best to make it so that just like you abstract off of a database layer so you can move it out, how do we do similar things to abstract around languages? So that if we need to change one place, we don't need to totally throw out everything. It definitely becomes a lot harder, but at least thinking about that, recognizing that our languages, especially around JavaScript libraries, are changing so rapidly, and we want that flexibility.
Mm-hmm. A couple of people had questions around, you spend some time talking about logging and even like the metrics and data that's captured in observability. Given the type of data that you have, how you have to think about, PII, certain, financial regulations, how does that play an impact in the development process, the operational aspects of things, who can see what logs, what gets logged where?
So there's definitely, it's something we think about a lot, and figuring out how do we make sure that it is as sort of put away off to the side as possible so that it doesn't get in the way of doing operations. So like we have a UIM, Universal Identity Management, and account management systems that allow us to, they're the ones holding a lot of the user information, and then they associate that to a token. And so in all of our application logs, it's just a GUID token, so that we can then aggregate on users on client IDs and sort of see if a client ID or a user ID is having a bad outcome without knowing who it is at all. So it allows that high cardinality questions that are needed for observability to happen without running into PII. If we then need to figure out like, hey, we need to reach out to someone because they're doing something weird in our system, like some of our systems, we've built in a level of flexibility that gets dangerous at times. Like someone creates a giant portfolio with thousands of sub accounts and we run into problems. And so we actually need to say, hey, like your query is killing us. And then we also need to figure out how do we make sure that our system is smart enough not to let someone do that in the future. But we do need to actually contact someone and ask them to change their behavior.
Okay, and then maybe one last quick question. How do you all think about how you design your microservices? Is there a domain model that you all follow? Is there a bounded context model that you follow? How do you think about maybe the shape of what a microservice looks like there? Maybe are there like 3 guiding principles or anything like that that help you decide?
The biggest thing for me is versioning. It's not really so much around the other aspects, to make sure that it's set up so that if you succeed and then need to change, you don't blow other people out. And assume success and then figure out how you're going to run with it and grow after you've succeeded without destroying everyone that is using it.
Good advice. Good advice. Awesome. So with that, we're pretty much at time for today. So we've thrown up a couple links here on things that you can follow through and read more about both the topics of DevOps, see the new stuff that New Relic is announcing today, and also follow up with the ability to use things like the AWS free tier. Again, on behalf of Adam and Steven, want to thank you for joining us here for this this tech talk. Hopefully we see you again at a future one. Again, the recording is going to be made available and shared out here in the coming days. We'll also try to reach out and respond to some of these questions that we didn't get to. So if we didn't get a chance to get to it, sit tight and we'll try to get back to you. But again, thanks again for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe and take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.